Lectures on healing dyslexia and dysgraphia. I thank Professor Nahera for having invited me to give some lectures on dyslexia. I'm speaking to you about this very common severe learning disorder, namely the disability to read and to write. As you might guess, my accent is German. Yes, I come from Germany. So I'm also indebted to Professor Nahera and to Dr. Mertens for their kindness to do some corrections of my English. Over more than 30 years of psychoanalytic, psychotherapeutic and supervising practice, I came to discover what psychoanalytic treatments can do for dyslexic children and adolescents and how and why they learn to read and to write normally. I am fully aware of the many questions, the doubt and skepticism when new light is thrown upon a field where all seems to be set and structured to cope with sufferings like the disorder of dyslexia. But I am also familiarized with the still existing great misery, the helplessness and hopelessness among the affected people on the one side, and on the other side, how the difficulties with these school children might drive parents and teachers to despair. And this is still the actual situation. It is not my aim to simply suggest what kind of help should be done. I will present a series of lectures that are designed to provide a short overview of different scientific theories and methods to deal with the disorder of dyslexia. I shall comment on them by referencing on new research and of neuroscience and psychoanalysis. It is my aim to show how neuroscience and psychoanalysis are approaching each other, while also how they differ in understanding the main problems. Thinking and speaking about dyslexia involves many aspects to look at. Therefore, in order to gain comprehension, we have to look at from different viewpoints. So you may see, and I hope with some patience, that it is difficult to take the straight way to put my material across. Dyslexia concerns not only the complicated dialogue between neuroscience and psychoanalysis, it concerns new research about early child development, and it has also to do with cultural factors. Finally, I will give examples of psychoanalytic practice with dyslexic children and adolescents and summarize my treatment results. These results will lend to a new etiological hypothesis. I hope that this will enable everybody, also those who are not involved but simply interested in this kind of disorder, to forming his own opinion. Let me begin with the epidemiology of dyslexia and the actual dealings with it. One finds this disorder among people in wide sections of the population, from lower and upper classes, intelligent and less intelligent people. When a disorder is prevailing to such an extent as it is, one might ask, is the mastering of culture techniques like reading and writing less and less to be taken for granted? Indeed, the number of illiterate persons, even in countries which have compulsory education, is not only a great problem worldwide, but a still increasing one. The general clinical experience in Germany seems to be that more boys than girls are dyslexic. Why it is so has not been systematically explored hitherto. It is to be expected that about 4 to 5% people all over the world are suffering from this disorder. In European countries, at least 23 million citizens are affected. In addition, one estimates a high number of unknown cases. In Germany, the UNESCO assumes 4 million of illiterate persons. In the United States are estimated about 60 million of citizens to be illiterate. The UNESCO is speaking of functional illiteracy. That is to say, illiterate adolescents and adults from 15 years onwards are just able to write their name, but they cannot read and comprehend the whole of a text. In short, their ability to read and to write is very much reduced in spite of the school years they have had. Among the affected school-age children are many who break off school in early adolescence. So the social impact of dyslexia is often long-term unemployment due to the inability to follow regular theoretical courses of professional instructions and to do desk work. But even those who leave school normally risk not finding a job. This is not only harmful for the individual, but brings also financial burden for the economy of communities. So one can say the incidence of dyslexia concerns individuals as well as societies. This underlines the urgency to recognize where are the causes. How does dyslexia come into being? What have scientists done to deal with the problem? At least dyslexia has found access in the International Classification of Diseases. One has given the name of localized developmental disturbances in school skills. One differentiates between an isolated disturbance of orthography and a disturbance consisting more in reading disability. It is added that emotional and behavioral disturbances are frequently found as accompanying phenomena during school time. They are mostly understood as secondary symptoms due to the outbreak of dyslexia. One simply ignores the possibility that the so-called behavioral disturbances or other symptoms these children have often might already have their history in early childhood. It is important to underline these international classifications are only descriptions of symptoms, but we find no etiological conception. Have sciences no etiology? Indeed, there are etiologies, but are they the right ones? The prevailing scientific views have not brought up a solution of the problem. A great number of neurologists hold up the following hypothesis. Dyslexic children have basic visual and auditive disturbances being in connection with particularities of the central nervous system. A second hypothesis suggests hereditary factors. 3 universities in Germany are in ongoing research following the discovery of a gene named DCDC2 lying in a region of chromosome 6. This gene is described as being most effective in dyslexic children. To understand better the function of this gene, the EU sponsors a research project. In both of the hitherto explanations, there is a tendency to speak of an inborn defect and a static given of the brain. These assumptions are seen responsible for the way children listen to, read and write words. The problem is seen as an isolated one. How is handled the diagnosis of dyslexia? In Germany, and I suppose like in other countries too, diagnosis is made by orthographic tests. The mistakes are evaluated by quantitative and qualitative analysis following the age-appropriated expectations from each child. Additionally, there are neurological and psychological investigations, including explorations of the parents and the child, tests of intelligence, and sometimes encephalograms. In other words, what occurs is symptom diagnosis. It is important to ask what happens when such symptom diagnosis is made. Let us begin with the impact on children and parents. This may be very different. In the first instance, the diagnosis of dyslexia can give some relief. It takes a lot off the parent's mind, in the sense, we have not done anything wrong to the child. It is a bodily defect, and we have nothing to do with it. Similarly, the child may find a superficial balance of mind. Some tests might have given him the feeling of being intelligent after all. In addition, the child can expect that parents and school teachers will show consideration for his diagnosis. He will hope all will become easier for him. But the so-sought comfort in these ideas doesn't endure. Deep in his mind, there is much suffering. Often the tests, which may be conducted in a non-reflected manner, contribute to the child's feeling of being stigmatized. Being dyslexic means being and remaining dyslexic, and nothing else, and this forever. That is to say, the symptom diagnosis takes off any hope to become normal in every respect. How these schematized diagnostic handlings influence a child's mind is best illustrated in the following example. Here I am offering you a first little impression of psychoanalytical handling, in contrast to what is done usually. The chance that the child was brought to me, a psychoanalytical practitioner, arose from the fact that the parents had heard me speaking about dyslexia in the radio. So the family asked with some trust and hope for a first consultation in my practice. The family had already made the round of neurologists, psychologists, and logopedists. All authorities had given the diagnosis of dyslexia. Suggestions were made that the boy should participate in the training programs and that he should work with a logopedist. Logopedists offer trainings in speaking. I do not really know what kind of effect this shall have on dyslexic children. Anyway, it is done so. Now I present you the consultation. It is a family setting. I see little John, 10 years old. He looks very small between his tall parents. His lips are pressed together while mother tells me the journey for diagnosis they had done up to now, and that John would refuse to see the logopedist again. While I look friendly to mother, father, and son, I ask John if he can tell me about his difficulties, if he remembers when they began. John answers, it was in springtime. Now we had end of June. But I don't know what there was special. Then me, might it be that you felt much criticized because you hadn't done anything right? The boy looks at his mother. Yes, Mom scolds me every time when I make a mistake. Mother joined instantly. Yes, I know that is my problem. I lose rapidly patience and scold. But it is because I think John is so intelligent and ought to do things right. I remember his speech development. He was also late, but from one day to another he spoke right. I'm sometimes like an elephant in a shop of porcelain, but I'm also good-humored, and so Afterwards we get along with each other. While I continue to look friendly at parents and son, John begins to express his feelings. I am ashamed. I feel as if I stood on a platform which lowers into the ground, and I would become thin and thinner. I'm afraid about my future when one day I have to live without mom and dad and the help. While speaking, John scarcely moves his lips, and his words reveal his depressive mood. It is just a touching moment. Mother answers at once while she looks at me helpless and worried about what John had said. But the first time you speak in this way, why did you never express your feelings before? John remained silent. In order to relieve the situation for both of them and to gratify John's frankly given statement, I explain, it is not so easy to speak about one's thoughts, and one needs time to recognize one's feelings and to think about them. And then one has to encourage oneself to put it into words. The mind of John begins to brighten. He addresses himself at father. His look at father is an arch one. Dad always falls on his mouth when mom speaks. Mother, that's right, I speak more. Father, yes, I exercise restraint. I don't like to pick a quarrel. Mother answers, but when my husband is saying somewhat, his words are gospel for John. Father explains that he often buys a juice book for his son and that he's suggesting loud reading. He also recommends that John ought to do the unpleasant tasks at first. But unfortunately, John would never be in the mood for it and would never begin to work. Now it's me addressing myself at John. We have heard what your parents are thinking about you, but how do you think about your problem? John, I think that is already there in the brain when one is born. Then he becomes aware of my astonishment in my look, and immediately he alters his statement by saying, I wanted to say that there's still nothing. Me? You mean what you first said was a slip of the tongue, but it seems to me there was an important idea in what you said. Perhaps you think that your brain would only be all right when you can everything at first go. John nods and his head vividly. Exactly, it is so with football. All the other boys are much better than me. I'm good only in floor exercises. I'm in a sports club. Me? Oh, I see, that is interesting. Are the other boys doing football longer than you? Yes. Now I think you are in danger to take a wrong view of yourself. If the other footballers have done longer football than you, they have also worked hard to become good players. But you could not see how they played in their beginning because you came along later. For the first time, John smiles contentedly. I understand. First one has to work and then it is coming with pleasure. Me? Yes, you are right. And it seems to me, football, reading and writing could be very similar to you. Can you describe how you are when sitting to do homework? John opens his mouth wide, saying, I'm threatened by the letters. I'm always afraid that someone could observe me. Then I'm ashamed and don't feel like working any longer. And I become furious and then burst out crying. Me? It sounds quite sad how you feel. How you feel ashamed for things that are absolutely normal when one is learning something. People everywhere and with everything have to practice what they wish to do well. Nothing really functions at first go. After a little pause, I continue to ask John how things are going on when he cries. John, then Mom scolds, and then she helps me. Me? And what would happen when Mom would not help you? John and Mother answer unisono, then he would manage it. Me? Wow! Now you have brought to light that you are able to master your homework on your own. And I summarize, and it has become clear how much you have deprived yourself of your own success up to now. You only need some patience with yourself in order to discover the latent powers in yourself. Maybe it is not always easy to keep oneself in a good mood. You know all people are feeling alike and are sometimes furious. But even your bad mood cannot do any harm on the letters. They are simply waiting for you. We reach the end of the session. I offer that there could be arranged a next consultation after the vacations if this would be wished from parents and John. The parents agreed, and I add, I have the impression that John has all he needs in his ability to think and to work here and in general. John says, I can imagine to coming again. But John and his parents did not ask for a second interview after vacations. 3 months later, I get a phone call from Mother. She tells me John could separate from his parents to go to his aunt in another city during vacations. It was the first time he could do so. And with his aunt, a talented teacher, he trained himself in reading and writing. Now, everything was on a good way. John did not dislike school anymore and was proud of his good marks in orthography and reading. We see in the case of John the risk of being labeled a dyslexic child by diagnostic procedure that is made naively for arguments of symptoms. Probably, without my intervention, his belief in his brain lacking somewhat would have endured. Therefore, he would have been very unhappy and nothing would have changed. His case clearly teaches us that there were other reasons as well that matched with the labeling of dyslexia. For instance, he could scarcely tolerate that in football he was not doing as well as in floor exercises, and in his brain fantasy he brought the two things together. Unfortunately, other children tend to cling more on this labeling of dyslexic diagnosis. We see that even prominent people like the royal Swedish family makes no exception. The king and his children declare to be dyslexic, being unable to write normally. This was often to read in newspapers. The same confession was made to me even by child therapists and psychoanalysts. They had also suffered from dyslexia and made a long way to get out of that dilemma. So they were interested in hearing my findings and could agree with them. But in normal psychoanalytic therapy, being dyslexic is clearly a source of resistance. Why do children cling so easily on this labeling of dyslexic diagnosis? Well, it belongs to the human need to grasp for any explanation, to find a reason for something one can't understand otherwise. And it seems that it is preferably accepted to be brain damaged than to look into his inner world, a world which may be felt like a chaotic one. Children may produce all kinds of fantasies about their brain, being damaged, being born lacking somewhat in the brain, or being beaten by father or something else. And the danger is that this contributes to undermine their feeling of being able to change for the better. John put it in the fantasy of becoming bodily reduced and unable to cope with the challenge of life in the future. The chance of this interview was that John had already experienced that he could do things well. So he could accept my explanation and felt understood. And he could recognize and believe in a new perspective for himself, in which he was the actor and behaved like other normal people. And this was a conviction encouraging him to work with his aunt. But also Mother had learned that she had been somewhat overprotecting with John, so she had contributed to his dependence on her. But I have to underline, it is not always so easy to help a dyslexic child. While in this case I need only one session to help, in other cases it took years of treatment to help. These other cases I have in mind concern children who already have a very low self-esteem and never got sufficient credit from their parents' side for doing things well. These children will easily pick up such a diagnosis to fill it up with all kinds of fantasies about brain damage and how such a damage came about. In addition, they feel that they are not normal in other aspects too, because they suffer all kinds of symptoms, panic attacks of anxiety and/or psychosomatic hyperkinetic symptoms, stuttering and behavioral disturbances. Now, having in mind the case of John, it is important to compare what usually is given as therapeutic recommendation following symptom diagnosis. What say the neurologists? I'm still speaking of neurologists who stand for the current leadership in dealing with dyslexic children. Up to now, the recommendation from these neurologists for therapeutic help reads as follows: only systematic training can help the children learning to discriminate phones and letters. This way to deal with the problem and to understand the problem of dyslexia is adopted by society, by medical practitioners, by psychologists, school teachers and patients, and sometimes, at least in the past, even by professionals of psychoanalysis. The training methods to read and to write are all operating on a purely cognitive level. The methods are combined with trainings in sensory perception and in paying attention to concentrate. The methods reveal the standpoint that is behind them. It is a view which is held by numerous researchers regarding child development. They look at the child as if the child's emotional and the child's cognitive or linguistic development were independent and autonomous. So, as if the emotional and the intellectual would have nothing to do with each other. To this point, I will return later in my lecture. Clearly, here we see what makes the difference between psychoanalytic therapy and the other just described methods of training dyslexic children. These methods give the impression that things are rather hammered into the child's head, and the children don't like it. Does it bring help? There are training educationists reporting that children progress over the time. It seems to me this may depend on two factors. First, that the educationist is a talented and emphatic person who believes in the potentialities of the child and is able to handle the possible negative effects of the child, and second, that the child he meets is a less disturbed child. In other cases, children break off their trainings, and many of them even break off attending school. In the general consideration of most people, the disorder is seen as growing more or less better, but not healed by the training methods. The disorder is often kept secret in adult life. All patients I have seen, and equally report many colleagues of mine, exercise the offered trainings neither with motivation nor success. Why it is so? Well, apart from all more or less good educational attitudes, and apart from a method which may be felt by the child as being manipulating, here we reach the limits of symptom diagnosis and the given therapeutic consequences, namely same symptoms, same training programs. That equation does not come out. But to prevent any misunderstanding, I am not arguing against trainings of reading and writing, but one has to take into account the enormous emotional factors which potentially are linked to these demands, and so one has to look at the individuality of each child and his proper problems. As we have seen in the case of John, he could do his necessary trainings with his aunt, but only after having been helped in understanding himself. And that is what I mean when I talk about the essential need of a dyslexic child. Each child has to be helped individually. The reason is no dyslexic children is like another dyslexic child. So we are at the point to turn to psychoanalysis. But before talking about psychoanalytic diagnostic procedures of dyslexic children, I have to give some framework. What about psychoanalysis and the problem of dyslexia? Essentially, psychoanalytic theory and practice tries to understand the unconscious and psychodynamic meaning of symptoms in general. In the international literature, we find even many psychoanalytical publications on the topic of reading and writing disabilities. I can't go into the wide range of details about this literature, but I find some aspects still valuable and can agree with. Naturally, these publications went several decades of the beginning until mid of the 20th century. That is long ago. Findings and therapeutic vignettes were described on a neurotic level, keeping in line with the former era of psychoanalysis. Unfortunately, former, mostly American research essentials have not been taken over or ignored by the reading public of psychoanalysis. So, psychoanalysts failed to really appreciate the relevance of a psychoanalytic challenge. In consequence, thoroughly examination of psychogenesis and single case studies have been neglected. Perhaps this must also be seen in the context of science history. Here I want to quote a sociological point of view. It is always good being aware of how psychoanalysis is perceived from the outer world. So the Austrian sociologist Schülein wrote in 2003, psychoanalysis concentrated for a long time mainly on its inner world and somewhat isolated from outer contact. By this, it contributed to an increasing loss of external interest in psychoanalysis. Additionally, psychoanalysis failed to show what it had to offer. No wonder that others displayed their research results and their conclusions from it in many interesting publications. But that was a case of genetic biological views. The following consequences for dyslexia were the increasing holding on the genetic biological view of this disorder as we see it up to now. The psychoanalytical, psychosocial model of child development was not taken into account anymore in building an understanding view of this disorder. And the psychoanalytic community kept aloof towards the problems. One has to add that also child analysis and adolescent analysis never got the same attention among psychoanalytical community than psychoanalysis of adults. So, whatever the reasons, a still lasting belief in the genetic biological view and a policy of restraint and avoidance became visible. Nowadays the situation has changed. In science history we are at the beginning of a complicated dialogue between psychoanalysis and neuroscience. Neuroscience is important for us in the sense of neurodevelopmental science. From neuroscientific research we have learned more and more about the brain as an interactive system and a dynamic whole. The old prophetic hope and view of Freud himself that one day it would be possible to discover the brain organic basis of our mind is increasingly in development. Here I like to quote Nachera, 2001. Indeed, the biological basis of what we call the mind and its many functions are finding their anatomical basis in various brain structures or combinations thereof. Similarly, we are beginning to understand somewhat better the multitude of neuroelectrobiochemical processes at the root of thought, consciousness, dreaming, and many other functions of the mind. Advances in the technology of radiological neuroimaging have allowed scientists to observe the brain in action in a number of different and experimental situations. We can thus determine what areas of the brain may be involved at any particular time when we are exercising certain functions such as thinking and imagining, or when we are experiencing certain emotions. These methods also These methods allow us to look at the functioning brain, and though the techniques involved still have many limitations, they have opened previously unimaginable windows into what is going on in the brain at various times. End of quotation. As you might see now, we have to take into our discussion these thoughts, because dyslexia is labeled to stem from a kind of brain damage. The greatest discovery in our modern era is, so put it Norman Deutsch in 2009, the neuroplasticity of the brain. Following Deutsch and the experiments explained by him, so even where there is a physiological damage in the brain is able to compensate the damage by finding and sprouting new pathways. In addition, we are told that emotional stress is not very different from brain damage, because emotional stress has also effects upon the anatomy of the brain. I think this is an important bridge to the understanding of a learning disorder like dyslexia. This fits together, for example, with my findings of emotional stress and traumatization in early childhood of many dyslexic children. This only to your information beforehand. I shall come back to this point later. I will try to go on in contradicting traditional neurological hypotheses. This will be possible by showing how psychoanalytic research becomes plausible on the bedrock of neurodevelopmental research. As we have learned nowadays, the growth of the brain and the structure of the brain are to a great extent dependent on experiences. The structure of the brain improves by repeating actions and experiences. As Nahera 2001 put it, evolution has not provided it, the brain, with the clear instinctual patterns of behavior as observed in other species, since the human infant is helpless and dependent on parental care and teaching for an inordinately long time. Nahera goes on to use the beautiful metaphor of a computer for the human brain. It is not enough to have acquired the best computer possible for a given child. It is also necessary to program it wisely and efficiently. The best computer, if mishandled and badly programmed, will be an inefficient piece of equipment. Quotation is ended. Now, our next question must follow. How are we to understand the genetic givens, the genes? This is the second hypothesis given by a great number of traditional thinkers of neurology. Here again, research allows the conclusion that all the genetic influences can be altered by environmental ones. I am referring to Soames and Turnbull in 2004. This does not mean that the genes would not have any significance, but it means that early experiences with the environment can trigger the expression of genes or the contrary. To put it in another way, where there is a genetic vulnerability, this genetic vulnerability can be made reversible by the early experiences with the caregiver. Here I have quoted Fonagy et al. In 2004. So, if we take into account this knowledge, there are still not discussed questions waiting for an answer. Namely, what are the essentials in the early experiences the baby must make? Or, if these experiences are not good enough, what kind of help would be necessary later in psychoanalytical therapy to set in motion a process of repair? To avoid any misunderstanding or all-including expectations of undoing damage, when I am speaking of not good enough experiences, I confine myself on children who have been raised in their parental home, in contrast to children raised in a foundling home. But I think the end of my contribution will allow to underline the factors leading to what Nahera in 2001 calls the disastrous results produced by institutionalizing child-rearing practices such as daycare. Now I come to theoretical as well as technical questions to which neuroscientists seem still to have nothing to offer. Neuroscientists have only looked at the brain. They have not looked at, or not enough, at the impact of interpersonal and emotional relationships on the early developmental processes. But this is the domain of child psychoanalysis. Here we are at the point to discuss the role of affects. Great theorists of early development such as Anna Freud, René Spitz and John Bowlby, among many, many others, have already explored early emotional experiences for subsequent personality functioning. But now we are in a better position through systematic research of early baby and child development. The field of psychoanalysis has been enriched by extraordinary research results about early human development and regulation of affects. I shall refer on this topic by quoting Greenspan and Schenker and Fonagy et al. You are right in waiting for an explanation about the role of affects in the learning process of children. I can summarize: affects guide all our behavior and affects guide every learning step. But what does it tell us about the outbreak of dyslexia? Well, this is not to be answered in one sentence. We have to ask, are there any precursors forerunning the outbreak of dyslexia? And how do they relate to the affective system of dyslexic children? I already made some hints when I stressed the necessity to take into account the emotions of dyslexic children. But to fully understand the role of affects, we need to know more about affect research and affect development and the process of managing affects, so things become better understandable. From a theoretical viewpoint, there are remarkable controversies among researchers throughout several disciplines. Affect research is of ongoing interest, together with the question how reason and affect relate to each other. So, as clinicians, we can profit of controversial discussions and reflect upon our own experiences with patients in identifying our own position to the best understanding of psychopathology. What are the main dichotomies? What are the main dichotomies about the understanding of emotions? In Western culture and philosophy, the duality between emotions and reasoning has a long tradition. This goes back to the old Grecian philosophers. In the ideas of Aristotle, reason and affect are belonging together, and tamed affects are of significance for satisfying human life. But for the Stoic thinkers, affects are uncontrollable and impossible to cultivate. Affects have therefore to be suppressed, so that only reason has to govern human behavior. A later version of this doctrine stems from the French philosopher Descartes. For him, emotions constitute the animal side of human behavior. The innate feelings, moods, and mental states that are involuntary and automatic. Reason is seen as independent from emotion. Reason ought to govern emotions. While reason is worth striving for, the significance of emotion is cut down. This Cartesian model of thinking became the dominant one and is effective still today. Even among neuroscientists, there is still a struggling with the duality between emotions and reasoning. So Fonagy et al. Report, some of the neuroscientists agree that affects are ideally integrated with cognition, others see affects totally independent from rational thinking and even running counter to rational thinking, and so remaining out of control. Some of the neuroscientists have taken the position that both of these doctrines can refer to brain structures being probably agents for our emotional life. Why these introductory remarks about affect research? I must repeat and remind us that dyslexia comes along as a learning disorder. As I have criticized, the usual therapeutic programs are addressed purely at the rational capacities of a child. Now we can suppose that the theory behind may be still a key feature of the Cartesian theory, namely that our cognitive and linguistic faculties are seen as autonomous phenomena. From my therapeutic view, I can't agree with. But before speaking about my own experiences, I will explore what is the view of other psychoanalytic theorists. The most interesting question must be, how comes about an integrated view of affects and conscious logical thought? Or the question, how come about subjective feelings in an infant? I like to quote the interesting view of Greenspan and Schenker. The authors wrote in 2004, affects bridge the world of the physical and the mental. The authors believe that this process gets started by a dual coding of experiences. They give us the example: a baby touches its caregiver and registers both a physical sensation and pleasure. Then there is coded the experience of the physical side, and at the same time is coded the affective experience of pleasure. This is so because the human nervous system has the capacity, even at birth, to perceive differences in these double-coded sensations. These are the words from Greenspan and Schenker. But to develop this capacity to discriminate or to detect differences, the caregiver must interact with the baby. The caregiver must exchange sights and sounds. He must comment what happens in the interactions. Following Greenspan and Schenker, only these experiences help to establish the central nervous system's pathways, which have to do with emotional discrimination and regulation. The authors also explain the very similar way by which the baby's motor responses move beyond reflexes and become part of an effective motor pattern. Also, this step becomes possible through the double-coded motor responses. The affective side may, for example, lie in the shared mother-infant pleasure, when the infant looks at her and begins to move towards mother. Then the motor behavior of the child is guided by mother's voice, by her smile, and by her attention for the child. When a mother does not react in this way, the child may move without control over his legs and his body. I can vividly agree with these theoretical formulations because we see this relative lack of connection between the sensory affect and motor system so often in children who have constantly falls and lose their balance. The developmental history of such a child may reveal and confirm what is lacked in his relationship with mother. I come straight onto this aspect of an 11-year-old dyslexic boy from whom I will present you the whole case next lecture. This boy had constantly trouble with his unrest in school. He had many falls all the time and scars all over his body. And this was so since he began walking at the age of 13 months. Mother told me when the little boy had falls, she did not interfere to help him. She kept enduring and inattentive because she felt that he had to learn from his own experiences. But this did not function, and the little boy from his earliest times on, he was called a blockhead. Here we see the far-reaching consequences of mother's early emotional neglect. In her refusal to interact emotionally with her child, she had also lacked to initiate the process of symbolization in this area of the child's development. That is to say, the boy had not learned to move in a planned and regulated way. To follow the explanation of Greenspan and Schenker, the leap from automatic actions in this area, it were the motor patterns, to a planned action, comes about by investing something or someone with emotion. This has also to do with the fact that the child has become able to hold onto the image of something pleasurable, that he has separated his perception from automatic action or from catastrophic affective responses like flight or fight reactions. These are steps our little Jimmy had not developed. He continued to experience his own motor patterns without any self-awareness. How his life continued, how traumatizing experiences accumulated, I will tell you next lecture. What I intended to show you with this little developmental vignette and referring to Greenspan and Schenker is the following. For every stage of early development in all areas, infant and toddler need sufficient emotional attentiveness, devotion, and affective signals from their caregiver. Only by being emphatically perceptive, affectively attuned, and therefore safe object, mother or another caretaker really takes care for every progressing step of the child. How this process continues in later developmental stages and how one stage has to do with the next, we will see in the following second lecture. I will come then to the caretaker's role in the process of language development and symbolization as well as mentalization. That is to say, I shall continue to focus on the early affective system of communication and his significance for development in general and for evaluating psychogenetic material from dyslexic children in special.